Our second capstone presentation today is by Bennett Williams, and this is his thesis statement. America does not know how to love one another because of an obsession with material gain. To combat this, one can enter into community with the poor, and in doing so, become poor himself. Please welcome Bennett.
My dear and beloved brother, the treasure of blessed poverty is so very precious and divine that we are not worthy to possess it in our vile bodies. For poverty is that heavenly virtue by which all earthly and transitory things are trodden underfoot, and by which every obstacle is removed from the soul, so that it may freely enter into with the eternal Lord God. Here, St. Francis highlights the twofold reality of poverty. Firstly, poverty is not something that we should tend away from, but rather is a heavenly virtue. Second, poverty removes that which hinders the soul from achieving communion with God. Our society today would have you think the words of St. Francis belong to the past and have no bearing on our modern culture. However, in today's world of materialism and profit, poverty is a more necessary tool than ever for salvation. America does not know how to love one another because of an obsession with material gain. To combat this, one can enter into community with the poor, and in doing so, become poor himself. In order to prove my thesis, I will first highlight the epidemic of loneliness facing America and why it is a result of material obsession. Second, I will distinguish between the two types of poverty, namely poverty of fact and poverty of spirit. Lastly, I will explain how this dual understanding of poverty is the solution, and how community with others, especially the poor, flows from it. The disease that plagues America most is not material poverty or physical disease, but the epidemic of loneliness. Mother Teresa said, "The greatest disease in the West today is not tuberculosis or leprosy. It is being unwanted, unloved, and uncared for." Mother Teresa had seen desolation throughout her life while serving the people of Calcutta, and yet she says loneliness is the most terrible disease. Our society today, despite economic prosperity, is plagued with the same disease of loneliness described by Mother Teresa. The cause of this loneliness facing the West is spelled out by John Paul II in Solicitudo Rei Socialis. He writes, "The more one possesses, the more one wants, while deeper aspirations remain unsatisfied." Society will tell you that this deep ache of loneliness comes from not having enough. However, the root of loneliness in America comes from an obsession with material things. In Centesimus Annus, John Paul II states, "Alienation happens in consumerism. Through increased isolation in a maze of relationships, marked by destructive competitiveness and estrangement. Materialism leads to loneliness because of the illusion of self-sufficiency that comes with monetary success." We have grown too attached to material possessions to love one another freely. We live in a materialistic society in which acquiring stuff is not only the norm, but applauded. According to the Wall Street Journal, Americans spend $1.2 trillion per year on non-essential things. Materialism is America's enduring religion. It is because of an intense and almost pious obsession with material goods that we are faced with an increase in loneliness. As Scripture urges, we cannot serve both God and mammon. When we close our hearts on something small and passing, such as wealth, in doing so, we give up everything. The more material things that we have, that we close our minds and hearts on, the less we can receive. Furthermore, perhaps one of the most dangerous aspects of an obsession with material goods is that it promotes a lack of respect for human dignity. In a society where profit is the supreme good, people are often exploited to optimize monetary gain. The Catechism states, "An economic theory that makes profit the exclusive norm and ultimate end of economic activity is morally unacceptable." The disordered desire for money cannot but produce perverse effects. It is one of the causes of the many conflicts which disturb the social order. Here, the Catechism spells out the danger that comes with a materialistic society. It is important to note that the Church does not tell us that any one economic system is best, nor does it condemn capitalism, and even praises private property as good and necessary. Pope Leo XIII writes in Rerum Novarum that private ownership, as we have seen, is the natural right of man, and to exercise that right, especially as members of society, is not only lawful, but absolutely necessary. That being said, the sole reason we have a moral right to private property is so that we may be stewards of it. However, materialism hinders us from being stewards of private property, For when we grasp some material good, we become chained to it and unable to open to ourselves community and charity. Both loneliness and a lack of respect for human dignity flow from material obsession. Therefore, we are left with but one solution: poverty. Through poverty, we can renounce the draws of worldly possessions and learn to love better. But what is poverty for a Christian, and how does one live it out? We must first understand the two types of poverty, namely, poverty of fact and poverty of spirit. Poverty of fact is described by Dominican theologian Basil Cole as an actual and concrete deprivation of possessions, whereas spiritual poverty is the deeper reality that Christ speaks of in Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, when he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Poverty of fact is the means by which we attain the higher good of spiritual poverty. When we give up our physical possessions, we become more disposed to embrace God as the true wealth of the human heart. The core of spiritual poverty is kenosis, which in Greek means to empty oneself. St. Paul, in his epistle to the Philippians, writes about Christ being the ultimate example of kenosis. Kenosis is essential to living out spiritual poverty because it enables one to see the things he has as not really his, and thus leads himself to be detached. This is not to say, however, that one who has many possessions is not in danger of damnation if he is detached in some abstract way. For the call of kenosis is a high and challenging call, and is nearly impossible without some sort of poverty of fact. The man who sees what he has as God's will not be afraid to give to his brother in need. St. Thomas Aquinas writes, "Man should not consider his material possessions as his own, but as common to all, so as to share them without hesitation when others are in need." When we view our possessions as God's, we release our grasp on material things, and we are freed from the chains which we are so often unaware of and which bind us to our wealth. No longer consumed with the desire for material things, we are more able to enter into community with others, especially the poor. In Acts of the Apostles, the early church gives us an example of the demeanor we ought to have towards material things while in community. It states, all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all. Here, the early church provides us with an example of a true community. This shows us how we must be detached from our goods and share what we do not need with others. However, it is often hard to know precisely what is asked of us when it comes to balancing providing for ourselves and our family with the call to radical charity. In Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII states, "No one is commanded to distribute to others that which is required for his own needs and those of his household, nor even to give away what is reasonably required to keep up becomingly his condition in life." What this means practically in our lives is something we must each discern for ourselves with fervent prayer and a spirit of poverty. Through poverty, we become better at entering into community with anyone because we can love more freely. However, more importantly, we become more disposed to give to the poor and enter into community with them when we embrace spiritual poverty. The Catechism highlights the importance of caring for the poor. It states, "It is by what they have done for the poor that Jesus Christ will recognize his chosen ones. When the poor have the good news preached to them, it is a sign of Christ's presence." The Catechism highlights how important it is to care for the poor and preach the gospel to them. Poverty is not a problem that we can solve. However, what we can do is love the people afflicted by it, which is by no means insignificant. As Christ said in Matthew chapter 25, verse 40, "Amen, I say to you, whatever you did for one of these least brothers of mine, you did for me." To truly enter into community with the poor, we cannot just give money and think that is enough. But rather, we must spread the gospel to the poor through showing them the radical love of Christ. True and authentic love is rare in our society because of reliance on material things, which is why we must embrace poverty so that we can share Christ's love with others, especially the poor. America is faced with a severe crisis of loneliness because of society's materialistic nature, which is why, to love freely, we must practice poverty. Through poverty, we can enter into community with our brother the poor, as Christ urges us. Money is a great and dangerous temptation, which is why, in a society where having it is often necessitated, we must practice detachment. Through kenosis, we can empty out everything that we have and see ourselves as stewards of God's many gifts. While we might not be called to wear sackcloth like St. Francis, we must all enter into the very same poverty of spirit, through varying degrees of poverty of fact. For poverty is that heavenly virtue by which all earthly and transitory things are trodden underfoot, and by which every obstacle is removed from the soul. Thank you.
questions?
Mr. Anson.
Thank you for your presentation, Bennett. You talked about materialism and destructive competitiveness, the acquiring of non-essentials, and they seem to have a sort of financial basis or a monetary drive kind of behind them, creating this loneliness that you described. I'm curious if you see time, or specifically busyness, as maybe an equal cause to some of the problems that you spoke so well about.
Thank you for your question. I think those two are very connected. I think in America, the reason we have materialism is because ever since America's founding, we've had a great emphasis on the importance of work. And that started off as a good thing. But over time, it became an obsession. It became an obsession with work, which led us to have material possessions and wealth be the proof of our work and our obsession with work. So I think we often busy ourselves to attain material wealth, even though neither of those things will bring us true happiness.
Thank you.
Mr. Brother Francis of Jesus Crucified.
Thank you, Bennett, for your beautiful presentation. I was wondering how we could look at the Trinity as an example of poverty and communion, specifically looking at the second person of the Trinity in the Incarnation. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. To start off with the point about the Trinity itself as a whole, I think Trinitarian theology is very complex, but what is known about it is that it's a communion of persons. And what I talk about in my presentation is that to have a true and authentic community, we need poverty. So it's kind of an image for us of how we can have a true community by pouring ourselves out entirely. And as far as the second person of the Trinity, I think Jesus is obviously the ultimate example of kenosis and poverty, because he is God incarnate. So he came down to our level and became a poor beggar so that we may imitate him.
Thank you.
Miss Lees.
Thank you for your presentation, Bennett. Your opening quote from St. Francis and your closing lines about seeing poverty as a brother reminds me of a part of the Paradiso, which the sophomores and I will be reading in a couple of weeks, where Dante describes St. Francis and his pursuit of poverty as chasing after a lover, like seeing poverty as a woman to woo and kind of impress in some ways and to live with. And I wanted to know what you think about that analogy, and if it's helpful, or maybe if there's another analogy for pursuing a life of poverty that could be more helpful.
Thank you for your question. I definitely think that having this analogy as poverty as a lover we're trying to woo can be extremely helpful for our lives. Because we have to know poverty isn't easy to practice, and it's going to take time to see it all the way through. So in a similar sense, like trying to woo someone, it takes time and it takes effort and care. So we have to see our relationship with poverty in a similar light, I think.
Thank you.
Mr. Bergen.
Thank you for your presentation. Could you practically elaborate on what poverty of facts might look like for you and your classmates here?
Absolutely. I would say poverty of facts can look very different depending on your state in life. For me and my peers, it might look like carrying cash on you, so when you see someone on the street, you can give of what you have to them. And also, a separate note I would say is, as Mother Teresa described, that the greatest disease is loneliness. If maybe we don't have as much material possessions that we're stewards of because we're so young, we can give others our time and our care. So like my example with seeing someone who's experiencing homelessness on the street, we can maybe ask for their name, smile at them, and tell them that they're loved, to show them that they are an image of Christ to us. Mr. Gray.
Thanks, Bennett. I was wondering if you had any concrete examples, or if you could imagine concrete examples where in your own life or in the life of your peers, having excess of material things or certain material things might cause either you or those around you to experience that loneliness.
Thank you for your question. I think that is definitely true with technology, because through technology we have a sort of false sense of community that's not really there. So through technology we think that we're in community with others, but since there's no real poverty there's no interdependence upon one another, there's a lack of a true relationship and a true care for one another.
So you're saying that by getting rid of the technology, I would be pulled into community in some way?
It would definitely make you more disposed to community because you don't have that false sense of community that's distracting you.
Thank you.
Dr. Brumfield.
Thanks, Bennett. Is your argument that poverty is a necessary cause of the love that leads to community, or an instrument that can lead to it?
I would argue that community is the fruit of practicing poverty. So when we practice poverty of fact, that makes us more inclined to live out poverty of spirit because we don't have that physical connection tying us down. And when we're free of our possessions in our heart, we can be more disposed to focus on the people and God who are in front of us.
Thank you.
Are there any senior questions?
Mr. Myers.
Thank you for your presentation, Bennett. In history class, I learned about Gnosticism, and they have this ideology that you should reject the material world completely and that it's inherently evil. So I guess, what would you say to a Gnostic, and would you agree with them, or like, how do you differ from Gnosticism in what you're saying?
Thank you for your question. I would say the Christian views material things and wealth as a means to a good end, possibly. Like, material things can be used for good. Like, providing for yourself and your family is inherently a good thing. But wealth is often a temptation because it leads us to possibly be too attached to our possessions. Whereas the Gnostic just sees all material things as bad and kind of misses the point where you can still have material possessions and use them for good ends.
Thank you.
Jacob.
Thanks for your presentation, Ben. I was curious. I think one of the biggest reasons we're encouraged to generate wealth in our society is for the sake of stability and safety, in a way. And so I was wondering, in what ways, you said poverty can help us generate, like living a life of poverty can help us, or the fruit of that is community and love. In what ways do exposure and a lack of safety and stability kind of generated from a lack of wealth help us love in our community, if that makes sense? Like, what is the precarity related to love?
Thank you for your question. Dorothy Day describes precarity of love as sort of being detached from your material things so much that you don't even worry about the effects of not having them. So this could look like a lot of different things. This could look like you see a person on the street and you try and be overly generous. So you don't think about, what do I need this money for? You just give them what you have on you. So I think there's a lot of good to being precarious with your love and kind of being dangerous with it, because we're called to have an abundance of charity and be overly generous.
Thank you.
You're welcome.